he enjoys horror more since we've been together. And no, he really liked it.
See, I think it's different for me. I think Jeremy's actually hating horror more since he's been with me than less. Hello everybody, welcome back. If you are new here, my name is Phil Marriott. This is Paul Joseph, and I always get it wrong. I've got to learn to do it in the opposite direction.
Yeah, I got it right as well.
So if you are new here, we are covering films. We do a lot of music interviews as well, but we cover all the new releases, whether it be at the cinemas or online. This particular film that we're talking about today is online. It's available on Shudder, which we've seen quite a few films of on Shudder. There's some really good ones coming up as well that we haven't actually reviewed yet. But today's film is Watcher, written and directed by Chloe Ukuno, based on an original screenplay by Zach Ford. And Chloe's actually one of the co-directors, or she did co-direct VHS 94. I've seen the original, but not that one. Have you seen VHS?
No. Anthology series, fine, but ones that are like in the same thing, that are lots of short films, I just feel like it's just lots of short films. It doesn't really...
Okay.
I just find it a bit unsatisfying.
I should say before we start, I've got the window open because it is incredibly hot here in London. I mean, all over the UK pretty much, I guess. But yeah, I've got the window open, so you might hear a bit of street noise.
And I've got a fan on, so you might hear a whirring. That's not me. That's not the cogs of my brain going.
You got two fans. Go on, give us a fan thwack.
Oh, yeah.
What's that in your hand?
Beautiful, isn't it?
Yes.
You should have had that when we reviewed her film.
Yeah. I don't think it was in my possession at that time, actually.
So this film is shot in Bucharest, in Romania. I've got to say, I was really looking forward to seeing this because I saw the trailer, and I think the trailer does perhaps give a little bit too much away, which is one of the bugbears of mine, that trailers just reveal too many details. But it's about a serial killer who is dubbed the Spider, who stalks the city, and Julia arrives. She's moved because her husband has got a new job, so they've relocated. The husband is Francis, played by Karl Glusman. The lead is Julia, who is played by Maika Monroe. But this is also the feature directorial debut from Chloe Ukuno, because she's done a lot of shorts before, but this is the first feature. So the premise is pretty simple. It's fairly familiar, but I think what she does with this film is shot in such a unique way. You can see that she's inspired by a lot of films. It reminded me of, I don't know if you've seen it, the Brian De Palma film called Dressed to Kill.
Yes.
Which came out in 1980.
Yeah.
It reminded me a little bit of that. I mean, it's not a similar story.
Doesn't that have lots of people going up and down buildings in lifts? Is that why? You must think someone gets murdered in a lift.
Yeah.
Yeah. Angie Dickinson, is it?
That's right, yeah. Really good. I mean, I'm a massive fan of Brian De Palma. He's not actually made any decent films for a while, but yeah, back in the 70s and 80s, I mean, Carrie, we've talked about that before. So a fairly familiar story.
It's a familiar setup where somebody is in a place that's kind of unfamiliar to them, and they start to think that someone's them and they're not quite sure. I think there's probably three things that in this film really work in its favour. The setting of Bucharest is great because you just get these like amazing buildings and backdrops and stations and that places that I'm sure a film on a similar budget set in the UK or the States just wouldn't have access to, and it just looks brilliant, and it almost gives it that sort of slightly more classic Hitchcock type film thing to it. The fact that it's a American woman whose husband is American Romanian.
Yeah.
So she goes there for his work. He speaks the language, she doesn't. And we really, as an audience, don't ever really get to know much more about what's going on than she does. So you'll see clips of things on the news, but you don't understand it. And she has to have someone to translate. So there's that sense of really not knowing what's going on. She acts in quite a realistic way and doesn't do a lot of the stupid things that people would normally do in these kind of films.
Yeah, she doesn't fall into the tropes. She doesn't do any of the tropes that we see in horror films where it's really overplayed.
It all feels quite realistic, and there is the typical, is it all in her mind? Is she imagining it? Is she being paranoid type thing, which is played out really well. But I think sometimes films will go too far extreme in that direction, or it will just move into the realms of implausibility. But I kind of think the way that everybody reacts to her when she starts talking about what she thinks is going on, I think is really realistic. She's quite a sort of quiet protagonist. You know, there's a lot of the film that's just her wandering around and quiet and her responding to it. So the lead actress kind of carries quite a lot on her shoulders, really. I think does it really well. But it does have that sort of sense of feeling like a bit of an alien in a place that's unfamiliar to you. And she looks a bit like her, actually, Scarlett Johansson wandering around in Lost in Translation.
She was giving me Gwen Stefani vibes as well.
Oh, I was also getting a bit of Keira Knightley from her.
Yeah.
She definitely looks like someone who they would cast in lots of different projects where an actress who looks a bit like her wouldn't be available to do it. There's definitely something about the tone and the atmosphere and the simplicity, as I say, that reminds of those kind of like a much more classier, classic, old school type thriller.
I think that's why it reminded me of Dressed to Kill a little bit, because you're right about the Hitchcockian vibe, because I got that as well. I suppose, you know, when you think of Rear Window, it's got bits of that, because the story obviously centres on her in this apartment. There's something really creepy about that location as well. I mean, like you say, Bucharest, beautiful. I mean, the buildings, the architecture, but her flat is very minimal, and the rooms are really large as well. There's no blinds or curtains, so you get that creepy sense that, you know, people are watching. And of course, that's what the story centres on. It centres on her seeing somebody who's watching from one of the opposite apartments, and it all escalates. And there's also that kind of fear of, you know, women not being believed as well, because obviously the men in her life, you've got the policeman that comes to find out what's going on, and her husband, who kind of just brush off her fears, almost like, you know, they're saying, oh, you're just a kind of over dramatic woman that's making all this up, and it's all in your head. So there is that fear as well, which I think is really cleverly played, because I think a lot of horror films, you know, like we mentioned, they kind of fall into those tropes of making things too extreme. So all the jump scare stuff as well. You know, this has got some really jumpy moments in it, but I think it's largely down to atmosphere and brilliant acting.
I think there was what I watched it with my husband. I think there was one bit where we jumped massively, and it was just a train going past or something. And we were like,
I know, it's the same as well.
And then like giggling about it afterwards, which is really nice. But yeah, it's not silly jump scares. They're sort of meted out quite sparingly. So when there is a jump, it does work.
But the real horror, it really does come from that feeling of being misunderstood. You know, the boyfriend, the husband, is frustrating. You know, he's playing the part really well, as is she. I mean, she's terrific in the lead role. But, you know, he's brushing off her worries about the man looking into the apartment, and the tension. You know, the sound design as well is brilliant, because you've got that classical score as well, which leads you into a full sense of security as well, because you're thinking everything is pretty and beautiful and idyllic. You know, she's moved to this new apartment and this could be a really rosy future, but of course the flip side of that is that it becomes really nightmarish. So you do feel like everything is fine to begin with, even though the setting is, you know, quite moody.
I believe they don't use subtitles, so any time where she's like at a dinner party and he's with work colleagues and they're talking about what's happening, you only ever hear what they say, oh sorry, we were just saying this, or you get that sort of that translated version. So that just adds to her sense of, are people talking about me? Do they think that I'm just making this all up? And I think that's a really good technique.
I thought it was fantastic. I really enjoyed it. And also, I didn't think it was that predictable. You know, I mentioned that, you know, we've kind of seen the story before. It's a very similar story. But I think what the director does with it, I think it does feel quite fresh, even though it feels quite old-fashioned in a good way in a lot of this movie, because it feels quite classic, like you say. But I think that matches, you know, the location and the mood just perfectly.
The only slightly predictable thing for me was there was a certain character that I was like, oh yeah, they're there for it.
Did you predict the ending though?
No, because it almost lures you into thinking, is there something more complex going on?
Yeah.
And, you know, there is a bit of a like, oh, actually, could it be this person, or is there kind of, you know, more to something? And the ending is good, because also the ending has a bit of a double bluff, and you think something's happened, and then it's not, which relates to something that, you know, a character has mentioned about themselves very early on that you almost forget about. I'm talking very carefully because I don't want to give any spoilers away.
I know, it's really difficult, isn't it? There is a really creepy scene though. I mean, the bit that really terrified me was there's a scene on a subway train involving a carrier bag, and I'm not going to say any more than that, but let's just say that was brilliantly shot. I can't reveal what that is, but when you see the film, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. But I thought that scene was really creepy. And again, it didn't necessarily go where I thought it was going to go.
No. I think it's quite a credit to the film that it manages to remain fairly simple. Sometimes when you get into this genre, things can be trying to chase being something really out there or twist or this or that, that it just becomes a bit, you can almost see the mechanics of it all happening and it doesn't work. Whereas this, I think it's very thoughtfully done and stuff's not laid on very thick. It's great. I very, very much recommend it.
Yeah, me too. And I thought it was a really confident first feature film too. I'm really excited about what she does next because I think it felt like a film by somebody that knew what they were doing. Yeah, pressing all the right buttons for me, anyway. And
did you see that although she wrote and directed it, it was based on a script that had already been written? It was written
Zach Ford.
Yeah, and apparently it was on the blacklist. You know, the list of like hot scripts that are always going around Hollywood. That gets released by I think agents and producers contribute to it, and all the hot and that script was originally set in New York, I believe.
That's right. Yeah, I read that. Yeah, I'm glad they changed the location. No, nothing against New York. I love New York, but I think it adds, like we were talking about, it adds a certain kind of classic feel to the film.
I mean, I don't know if this was particularly low budget. I'm just assuming that there's not a lot of money for a lot of independent film these days, so it certainly wouldn't have been big budget. But
it doesn't feel like a low budget film. No, if it was.
But one of the ways of doing that is to film it somewhere, where it's going to be cheaper to film, and also you can get tax incentives and all sorts of different things. And sometimes people do that and they set a film but somewhere and pretend it's somewhere else. It's all a lot of US films are filmed in Canada for that reason and different things. But for this, actually, it very much is, it being set in Bucharest really works in its favour, I think. And I kind of think if it had been in New York, I think it would have struggled to have that sort of USP of the character being alienated.
I mean, I'm interested to hear what your husband, Tim, thinks of this, because I watched this with my other half, Jeremy, who's not really a big fan of horror. I would say this is a horror film, but it's not. I wouldn't want to put people off that don't like horror, because I think it would appeal to people who like that kind of mystery thriller element.
Yeah.
I mean, it is horror because it has got horror, a horror vibe to it. But I think that's a bit unfair for people that don't like horror, because I think they would enjoy it. Jeremy loved it.
Yeah, I think probably the sense of terror is probably higher than you would have in a thriller, and there's a little bit of gore.
Yeah, it's a bit grisly, just the thought of it as well, not necessarily what you see. Actually, some of what you see, I guess.
Yeah, similar. My husband is like, he enjoys horror more since we've been together, and I like it, but he doesn't like stuff that's particularly gory, and he's less inclined to want to watch something. And no, he really liked it.
See, I think it's different for me. I think Jeremy's actually hating horror more since he's been with me than less.
Also, one of Tim's favourite films is Charade, as they call it in America, which is the film. There's a scene where she goes to a cinema, and that's the film that's showing. It's an Audrey Hepburn film, which it's a great film. I think it's Audrey Hepburn and Cary Grant. Interestingly, and I'm sure lots of the viewers will know this, it's copyright free. Something happened, I think, when they made the film. They sort of messed up on something, so it's actually not in copyright, which is why I would think in a film like this, they can have a scene where they actually go and see someone watching in the cinema, and they actually show footage from it as well.
That's really interesting.
In the script, it might have been like, they go and see a Hitchcock film, and it's like, oh no, we can't get that. We'll have to use Charade.
It's interesting you said that as well, because I was thinking when watching this film, is this going to be a predictable kind of girl in terror, girl in peril scenario? And to a certain extent it is, but it does actually reference that in a really positive way in this film, because obviously it's directed by a woman director. But yeah, it's not that predictable, and it does.
No, and it's kind of like,
it tackles that.
As you said earlier, the response of some of the other people to what's going on isn't really satisfactory. So kind of, she's pretty much on her own in having to solve things and work out what's going on and deal with it. So it's great seeing that character do that.
I thought the acting was great. I mean, the supporting cast as well, but Maika Monroe, she gave such a great performance. It's totally believable as well. I really believe. Yeah. But I think largely that's down to what you said earlier about her not necessarily over-exaggerating the performance, because it was a very natural performance and it felt genuine. Final verdict for me, it's a 4-star. I thought it was great. Really enjoyed it.
It is also 4 stars from me.
Well, hey! So you can catch it on Shudder. It's available on Shudder. Not everyone has Shudder, but I would recommend you looking into it. I mean, I know obviously these are tough times financially, but yeah, there's some great stuff on there, and we're about to review another film on Shudder in our next video.
There is some really good stuff, and I kind of think, for a subscription thing, if you like horror and you like thrillers, there's a lot on there, and it's and the good thing about that what we're finding out is there's lots of new releases that are kind of going straight on there as well. I think it's definitely worth a subscription if one is in a position to get one.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, recently watched a program called Curse Films 2, which is on the screen now. Check out the playlist of the horror stuff as well, called Scary Shit. We don't mince our words. Boys on Film. Good to see you, Paul, as always. And thank you, everybody, for watching. We'll see you on the next one.